Welcome everybody to the last in our seminar series of this year. Seminar series is co-sponsored by the Centre for Education and Industry at the University of Warwick and also the Education Employers Task Force. Today we have a first because this is the first time we have a guest speaker who's doing his second seminar with us. Dr. Andrew McCoshan presented on comparative skills policies and educational policies for about a year ago, 18 months ago.
Yes.
And is back today, a very timely presentation in light of the recent OECD review survey of adult skills, to talk about skills beyond school in England and what the OECD review has to say about that. So, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, skills beyond school in England. In terms of the content of the presentation, I should initially say that I was contracted by the UK Commission for Employment and Skills to write the country background report, and that was completed towards the end of last year, more or less, and it was published. Took a few months to be published, and so it was published sometime in the spring. So that's my connection to this, and in fact most of what I'm going to be saying is drawn from the country background report. But naturally I'll say something about the OECD recommendations at the end. So I'm going to talk about the aims and objectives of the work and the English Country Review, hopefully give you an understanding of what post-secondary provision in England means, since skills beyond schools means for the OECD what happens after school, although there's a different, we put a different interpretation on that in the English context for reasons I'll explain. I'm going to outline the state of play, and also there'll be some threads running through this which are sort of structural issues related to the English system and how it compares to other systems, and then present conclusions and the OECD recommendations at the end. As I mentioned, I was contracted to prepare the country background review, but at the end of the process, the Institute for Employment Studies also had a contract to assist the OECD during their visit. So the country background report was prepared for the OECD essentially, and as part of that process, the country background report contained, along with a description of the situation within England, it also contained a statement of the strengths and weaknesses of the system, some analysis, an initial analysis at the end. Although that's actually not been published within the country background report, but that was used to inform the OECD work. So, what were the aims of the OECD project itself? Well, behind this is the growth in high-level skills in advanced economies, and the question of how educational training systems are going to respond to that, and the general issues which the OECD were looking at was whether there was the right balance between vocational and academic provision, whether the institutional frameworks within countries are fit for purpose in terms of developing high-level skills. Naturally, they were interested too in the quality issue, and whether provision is responding to industry needs at the moment. Of course, this project takes place within a wider context, not least the OECD's Learning for Jobs work of a few years ago. Country reviews were an option for OECD countries to take. They address subsets of programs and institutions within the framework provided by OECD, depending upon national priorities. And the initial work was to basically provide a description of the system, identify strengths and weaknesses, and give countries the capacity to compare themselves with other countries and undertake this self-assessment. The self-assessment part, which I mentioned, and actually wasn't published, but which fed into the OECD considerations. In England, the focus was naturally on current directions of policy, not least development of apprenticeships and the development of employer ownership. That's the broad context. Oops. the first of all, the important question is what is post-secondary vocational education training, the focus for the study. And for the OECD, it's vocational programs beyond what's called upper secondary provision. In terms of the standard international classification, it's levels 4, 5, 6. 5 and 6 are the tertiary level, and 4 is post-secondary but non-tertiary level. And I see people smiling already, and I always have a wry smile at this point as well, because that's a particularly difficult area to define for any country, and even more so when you're sort of comparing across countries. For the purposes of this study, we're talking about courses that are at least 1 year's duration, full-time, and lead to a recognised qualification. And so that actually excludes consideration of much provision in the UK, and in England, and I'll say that later. Definition of vocational, designed for and typically leading to a particular type of job. The study was also concerning institutions which were involved in post-secondary provision, and in which the majority of teaching was at post-secondary level. Of course, I'll get the hang of this now. For England, what does that actually mean? There are clearly a set of issues around that. Terms like intermediate qualifications and, from the employer side, technician are used in quite loose, flexible or imprecise ways, depending upon your perspective. Trying to apply the OECD framework in the English context meant that there was quite a reliance on extrapolating results from not much hard evidence as far as the country background report was concerned. That was a desk-based piece of work. Subsequently, the OECD did a set of visits, interviews with people to gather more qualitative information. In comparative terms, these difficulties with definitions make it difficult to locate and compare programs in England with other countries. I should say also that clearly this is a big canvas and I can't cover everything today. It's a very broad scope. So I would stick to some of what I think are the less well-known things, the things that when I was doing the research, I thought that's very interesting, offers very interesting insights into this question of provision at this level. So I'm tending to focus on that and saying less about the well-known things like apprenticeships and so on. So what was the scope of the country review for England? This was the scope. The boxes, there's a shaded here. Certainly there are two dark boxes there, levels 4 and 5 within the English system. There's actually some shading on level 3, which hasn't come out very well on the slide. So it's levels 3, 4 and 5 were defined as the scope for the English study. In other words, the OECD was concerned with 4 and 5, but in the English context, you couldn't really look at those meaningfully without looking at level 3 as well. Of course, levels 4 and 5, we're mainly talking about FE colleges being the mainstay of providers, along with some of the universities, the older post-1992 institutions. Private training providers tend not to be involved much in this, other than in relation to level 2 apprenticeships. What's the policy context for this? Why does the aspect actually matter? So there's two quotations from BIS, the New Changes document, which acknowledge that whilst there's been quite long-established provision at level 4 within colleges and providers, it's actually been a neglected area in terms of policy. And related to that, there's a pledge here to develop and promote the concept, identity and value of, in quotes, higher vocational education with clear, flexible and articulated progression routes into levels 4, 5 and 6. I should also mention that there's of course this wider European context, wider international context, and it's perhaps useful to compare England's position with that of other countries. Some of you may have seen this before. I know Tom has, although he might not remember, quite a long time ago now. This is essentially an idealised representation of many of the European education training systems, or at least the elements of it. You can read this diagram with the boxes either representing bricks and mortar, the establishments themselves, or representing programmes. And different countries, of course, have different, their systems are composed of different elements here. This post-secondary non-tertiary level, level 4, actually has 3 functions, which is to help students obtain further vocational qualifications once they've finished at level 3, perhaps to specialise, and in some countries it also provides an opportunity for people who've got to the end of general upper secondary education, can't go any further, to then cross over and actually obtain a vocational qualification to enter the labour market. But probably in the English case, the first 2 of those are important, i.e. further qualifications and specialisation at level 4. That's probably the main functions that we're talking about. If you then look at, well, how to map the English system onto this, I very vaguely put some bubbles on here, because, of course, in institutional terms, you can identify in general upper secondary education, sixth form colleges, 11 to 18 schools, and then in this area on the vocational side, you're talking about colleges and training, private training providers. And of course, at the tertiary level, we're more likely to have this mix of the general academic and tertiary level within the same institutions. I should say that in relation to pathways and people moving through these systems, there's a lack of studies in every country about actually how students progress through this. And so countries which are highly structured, like the German system, where you have these different components sort of institutionalised within the framework, you're supposed to follow these clear routes, but actually whether people do follow these routes and where they go in the labour market afterwards, that's a different question to the structural diagram itself. Of course, in the UK, our programmes and qualifications within here cover an enormous range, and the progression routes which people follow are highly diverse. In here, of course, we did used to have polytechnics. I'll return to this point later on, until 1992, and I think since then we've been trying to fill some of the gaps left by transforming polytechnics into universities with foundation degrees, most recently the UTCs, and also the diplomas, trying to ensure that there were adequate progression routes through the system. In terms of what actually happens to people who are trying to pass through this system, the evidence is a little scarce, but here's one of the examples that we can take. There was a study looking at what BTEC students actually study apart from their BTEC qualification. And interestingly, only under a third of BTEC students, a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago I think, only a third of BTEC students were studying just for their BTEC qualification. And the most popular additional qualification was key skills, 45%. And 10% were also studying for A-levels. But interestingly, by the end of their BTEC, only 7% were still actively studying a concurrent qualification. So that just gives a flavour and illustration of the sort of diversity that exists for individuals when they're in educational training post-16. Next question is, what can we say about the bigger picture, if you like, the whole landscape? Well, overall, we have about 16,500 qualifications at all levels, covering a wide range of things. Short courses to 2 to 3 year programmes. Interestingly, at any one time, awards may be made for only around 1/3 of the qualifications. So while there's theoretically 16,500, how many students are taking those is an interesting question. In relation to level 4 and above, there are something like 2,100 qualifications, which is about 1 in 8 of the total, about 13%. And in between 2006, 7, 2010, 11, the number of people increased for level 2, 3 qualifications from about 1.5 million to over 2 million. Interestingly, at level 4 and above, the numbers have kind of fluctuated a little and fallen. It's difficult to draw conclusions from this. It's worth pointing out that these are statistics about government-funded provision itself. So it's not really clear what it tells us, but I think one of the things is that the position on level 4 and above is you wouldn't say it's sort of a mature, stable position if the numbers are kind of fluctuating. In the terms of the share of achievements, which isn't the same, of course, as the number of people studying for government-funded qualifications, the share of achievements accounted for by level 4 plus is about 5.5%. So it's a small proportion. So, of course, the next question is, well, actually, is that how does that compare to demand within the economy for high-level skills? And the short answer is, it's difficult to say. OECD conclusion overall, which was ours, is that actually it's small, it's not big enough, and going forwards it won't be big enough. And I think that's a fair conclusion to draw from that. We can look in more detail at some of the high-level vocational qualifications. Okay, you haven't got the hang of this yet. This is one of the tables in the country background report, so it shows by level numbers and their proportionate share. And you can see how the numbers quite dramatically tail off as you get beyond level 4 to level 5 and 6. So we're really at level 5 and 6 talking about quite small numbers of people. Numbers are rising, however, so there's optimism there. If you want to compare this with, say, university level, there are something like 360,000 first degrees started each year. So again, that sheds some light on the differences in scale between the academic university level provision and these vocational courses. How are these spread across sectors? Level 4 plus, the achievements are dominated by these sectors: business law and admin, education training, health, public services and care. In relation to foundation degrees, which you mustn't ignore, there are about 83,000 students enrolled, and in any one year, about 27,000 students are qualifying, which is about 3% of the total student population. With these small numbers, it's not surprising that numbers of people taking each qualification is comparatively small, and actually in terms of numbers of achievements, the most significant qualification is a City and Guilds Level 4 award in preparing to teach in the lifelong learning sector, ironically enough. So I guess that's a good thing. What can we say about apprenticeships? A similar table, without the numbers. Of course, the numbers of apprenticeships is rising from 185,000 in 2006 to over 450,000 now, accounting for about 16% of government-funded learners. Again, you can see the numbers tailing off as you go up the levels, so that the higher level 4 plus, it's a very tiny fraction of all the total numbers of people on apprenticeships. Policies is concerned with making level 3 rather than level 2, the level to which learners and employers will aspire. Interestingly, the level 3 is defined as the technician level. I mentioned the difficulties of defining terms here, but that's one way of defining it. Policy is also to expand higher apprenticeships provision. There's a lot of scope as well to adapt the structure and content to sector needs, which is good from the point of flexibility. I actually compared two, one in food and drink and one in engineering, and just to give you an example, the entry requirements to the same level of apprenticeship vary, and the link to professional qualifications also varies. In engineering there are of course well-developed professional qualifications, not so in food and drink, and that clearly changes how the apprenticeships are positioned and seen within the sector. I also think it's unlikely to help public understanding of the value of apprenticeships when you get these variations across occupations. What can we say about the employer role in all this? Well, of course, they've got an important role, generally speaking, but again, the magnitude of their role is a bit hard to estimate generally, and more difficult in relation to this area. There are figures available on funding, for example, by employers, but it's hard to get a breakdown by level. But it's pretty clear that the provision at this high level is, a lot of it's done in company, it's short duration, it doesn't lead to a qualification. So unfortunately, theoretically it was outside the scope of the OECD framework. But I think that's important because I think it helps to tackle the bigger issue of where and how to position post-secondary provision strategically if it's going to be developed. What do we know about the effects of training? There's a repetitive theme here, data is scarce. But of course, in terms of progressing to university level, level 3 vocational qualifications don't normally permit entry to university degrees. There's a need to take something at level 4, so you do further steps. Not despite the fact, of course, there's supposed to be equivalents at level 3 between the vocational side and the A levels. And the report contains quite a lot about this topic, progressing from vocational to provision into universities. There are some interesting statistics available about BTECs from 2007, which found that 56% of people who took them qualified, and of those people who qualified, 41% took an undergraduate programme, but 42% took another course, most commonly key skills. It's very interesting. There's like this polarisation in terms of the people actually taking these courses. If you look at the people who didn't qualify, 40% of those people who didn't qualify went on to another FE course, so they basically dropped out of the BTEC and did something else, and they didn't go into the labour market. I think that points to some pretty major inefficiencies within the system. If people are, they're coming in and doing a qualification and they're doing other qualifications with it, they're succeeding or they're not, moving sideways into another qualification rather than having this direct route into the labour market. But interesting topic for discussion. On an international level, if you compare it with more highly structured systems where people come through and are supposed to obtain their qualifications and then get jobs. In some of those systems, you qualify an apprenticeship and you are an engineer. It's interesting actually. We look at some of those systems, we talk to people in Germany, say, what qualification do you get when you're an apprentice? They look blankly because actually they say, you are an engineer, you are a plumber. So it's that deeply embedded within the system. In relation to our apprenticeships, I won't rehearse the evaluations that have been done. There are of course positive benefits. In terms of progression, only 4 to 6% of apprentices progress into HE. I'm a bit worried about putting the word only because that implies they should be progressing. But that's interesting, that's often the way it's put, that actually there isn't sufficient progression. And in fact, European policy says you need to make vocational courses more attractive by offering the possibility to progress. But actually, if the apprenticeship is designed for labour market entry, you're kind of juggling with two different things there. Okay, trying to account for these issues is of course really difficult. But just to point to some structural issues, in England on the supply side, there has of course been this significant reshuffling of this framework, within which the provision we're talking about might actually be located. The history is very interesting. I won't go into details, but polytechnics were basically providing, they didn't have degree awarding powers, they provided provision that was validated by BTEC. Since then, BTEC qualifications have been shuffled off into further education. So it's a useful part of the history. Other countries, of course, have long-established, well-respected higher technical institutions. Also, there are different funding and governance regimes for higher education, vocational training and initial education. So where do you put this type of provision? And we know about the high degree of autonomy in our system and the fact that awarding bodies are a very distinctive feature, and that was picked up very strongly in the OECD report itself. On the demand side, two rather large quotes here from Brown, Green and Lauder, who have of course done really excellent work in relation to skills acquisition systems, and they contrast here the England with UK. Pardon?
Was done the last
Oh,
slide.
I'm sorry, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So we have a different system in England where skills acquisition relies more on individual social networks rather than institutionalised arrangements, social partnership arrangements in many countries. Also, there's maybe a structural divide between internal labour markets, where training happens within companies, and flexible labour markets. Internal labour markets tend to be for people, graduates, people more highly skilled, and flexible labour markets for the rest. So the question is, if you're developing this provision, it sits across these sort of divides, so it's quite difficult. And if you have a more formal approach, does that effectively require you to shift the focus out of the higher skills development, out of employers, and a less formal approach, less linked to qualifications, out of the in-company sphere, make it more formalised? That's quite a big challenge. In relation to conclusions arising from this, not surprisingly, with this level of the level of programmes, the level of enrolment and achievements I've talked about, you could say, well, a system for high-level vocational training as such doesn't exist. Many associate and professional level jobs are being filled by graduates, not those with level 3, 4 or 5 qualifications, which suggests an imbalance. We're almost at the position of needing to create the markets, because we have this vicious circle whereby you have students post 16 doing level 2 or level 3 qualifications. Which qualifications do they pick next? They're not available, so they don't pick them. Employers are not demanding them, and so it goes round. There's a question about labour market entry. Lower level qualifications are used to enter the workplace. What happens when we start shifting the boundaries? We've got this question of how vocational provision links into higher education. Also, are young people able to make well-informed choices? There's also a big issue about what happens in the initial phases of education, and that's of course in a state of flux. And we have a highly fluid institutional setup with increasing autonomy and voluntarism in the system. We have a development and clarification of the role of awarding organisations within all this, and we have the related issue of sector skills councils and their relationship with awarding organisations, and the whole employer ownership agenda, which perhaps we can talk about once I've stopped. And OECD recommendations themselves, well, they concluded too that there was a strategic need to expand post-secondary provision in England. The vast number of qualifications available, they concluded from that there was a need to rationalise qualifications through a franchising arrangement. So awarding organisations would bid to provide qualifications for occupational or professional areas, although with the proviso that a proportion of the curriculum would be available for local negotiation. They also said that the workplace element should be substantial and mandatory, because it was an important feature of the best programmes. And something I haven't talked about at all was professional development of college workforce, but that's one of their 4 overall recommendations. So there you have it, a very quick canter through across a very big policy area, but clearly there will be many questions to raise.
Thank you very much, Andrew.